My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of thieves!
Sooner or later, gotta cut you down.
How will you escape being condemned to hell?
This moment changes everything. In The Chosen Season 5, Episode 2, Jesus doesn't just flip tables, he flips the entire system. But here's what most people missed. This wasn't about anger. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about corruption. What Jesus did in the temple wasn't just a protest, it was a declaration of war. A war against a system that had shut people out, that had used God's name to build walls instead of bridges. This episode isn't just dramatic, dangerous. And if we look closely beneath the surface, we'll uncover something far more explosive than any temple scene. We'll see the real reason Jesus attacked the very heart of Jewish worship, and why that one moment signed his death sentence. Asterisk, at first glance, it looks like Jesus is simply outraged walking into the temple, shouting, throwing tables, spilling coins, and chaos everywhere. It's easy to think, oh, he's angry because of corruption, like we've always been told. That the money changers were greedy, the priests were taking advantage, and Jesus had finally had enough. But that's not what's happening. Because if we really pay attention, The Chosen gives us a different picture. One that isn't based on assumption or tradition, but on something much more unsettling. You see, there's no real historical evidence that the temple practices were corrupt in the way we often assume. Yes, the temple had money changers. Yes, animals were sold for sacrifice. But those systems were necessary. They were there to help people worship. Travelers couldn't carry animals hundreds of miles, and Roman coins with Caesar's face couldn't be used in the temple. So what was the solution? A fair system of exchange. And in fact, historical records suggest the fees weren't outrageous, somewhere between 4 and 8%. Hardly the kind of scam that would provoke divine rage. So then, why did Jesus do it? Why this moment? Why the drama, the violence, the fury? Because this isn't about money, it's about access. It's about who gets to be close to God and who doesn't. When Jesus steps into the temple, what he sees isn't financial corruption. It's spiritual segregation. The one space where Gentiles, non-Jews were allowed to pray, had been turned into a chaotic marketplace. The outer court, the only spot where outsiders could come near the Holy of Holies, was overflowing with sellers, animals, noise, and distraction. Imagine trying to worship in a place that smells like livestock and sounds like shouting vendors. That wasn't a holy place. It was a cage. And Jesus had come to tear it down. Because this, right here, is the moment when Jesus tells the world, the kingdom of God is not just for the few. It's not locked behind a curtain or hidden inside a sacred room. It's for everyone. And that truth was far more dangerous to the religious leaders than anything involving money. It was the reason they had to stop him. Asterisk, what most people don't realize is that Jesus wasn't just lashing out at a few merchants. He was targeting the temple itself, the heart of Jewish religious life. And that's what makes this episode of The Chosen so bold and so explosive. Because the temple wasn't just a building, it was everything. It was the center of worship, sacrifice, forgiveness, and identity. For centuries, it stood as the only place where heaven touched earth. But here's the shocking part. God never actually commanded his people to build it. Not once in the original law given to Moses do we see God ordering the construction of a temple. What he did command was a tabernacle, a tent that moved with the people, a place that never settled, never rooted in one spot, never closed off. But centuries later, King David had a dream. He wanted to build a permanent house for God, and God allowed it not because he needed it, but because the people wanted it. That temple, and the system it created, became the foundation of Israel's entire faith. A place filled with laws, rituals, and restricted access. A place where only the priests could enter the sacred spaces. A place where the presence of God was hidden behind a veil. And for generations, people accepted that system. They believed it was the only way to be close to God. But Jesus came to rip that veil in half. When he walks into the temple in The Chosen, he isn't just angry at what's happening, he's announcing the end of it all. That scene where he flips the tables, it's not just rebellion, it's prophecy. It's Jesus acting out the collapse of the old order. The sellers weren't breaking the law. The money changers weren't sinning. They were just symptoms. But the disease was deeper. A religion that had turned God into a gatekeeper. A faith that had walls where there should have been doors. And the moment Jesus begins pushing over those tables, He's pushing the first domino in a chain reaction that will end with his crucifixion. The leaders see it instantly. They know what this act means, because if Jesus is right, if God's presence isn't trapped in a building, if Gentiles and outcasts and sinners can walk freely into the kingdom, then everything they've built begins to crumble. Their authority, their rituals, their control. And in that moment, they make their decision. This man must die. Not because he's violent, but because he's dangerous. And all of it began with a few flipped tables in a courtyard most people didn't even care about. Asterisk, the real heartbreak of this episode isn't the chaos Jesus causes in the temple, it's the chaos he exposes, because while most eyes are focused on the tables crashing and coins scattering, Jesus is looking somewhere else. He's looking at the forgotten, the outsiders, the people no one notices. And this is where The Chosen draws us in deeper than any retelling ever has. Remember the layout of the temple. The court of the Gentiles was the only place non-Jews could come to pray. They couldn't go further in. They couldn't get close to the altar. They couldn't see the sacrifices or hear the prayers. That outer court was all they had. And now, it was filled with noise, animals, and money changers. It wasn't sacred, it was shoved aside, a spiritual dumping ground. And that is what set Jesus off. Not greed, not gold, but exclusion. And when he quotes the words, "My house will be called a house of prayer," he's not just talking about the Jews. That line comes from the book of Isaiah chapter 56 to be exact, and the full verse is even more powerful. It says, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations," for all people. That's the part we forget. That's the part Jesus was pointing to. In that single moment, with those words and that fury, he was declaring something revolutionary. God's presence is for everyone. The Gentiles, the broken, the unclean, the ones who never belonged. And in John's Gospel, when Jesus makes a whip and drives out even the animals, he's not being cruel. He's making a statement, a painful, prophetic statement, because those animals were part of the sacrificial system. They were the way people got right with God. And now Jesus is pushing them out, not to dishonor the law, but to show that a new way is coming, a new sacrifice, one that won't require doves or lambs or oxen, because he is the lamb, and he knows that when the temple curtain tears, the sacrifices will no longer be needed. Access to God won't come through a priest. It won't come through a ritual. It will come through him. And this is the part most people miss. The Chosen doesn't just show Jesus attacking a system, it shows him becoming the replacement. The moment he clears the temple is the moment he takes its place. And every overturned table is a declaration. The old has gone, the new has come. No more court of the Gentiles. No more outer spaces. No more barriers between God and humanity. That's why this episode hits so hard. Not because it's violent, but because it reveals just how far Jesus was willing to go to make sure no one was left outside. What's terrifying and beautiful is that Jesus knows exactly what he's doing. He knows that this one act will change everything, because this isn't just disruption, it's direct confrontation. And in The Chosen Season 5, Episode 2, we see the shift happen right in front of us. This is the moment the religious leaders stop whispering and start plotting. The moment Jesus moves from being a curiosity to a threat. And they're not reacting because he yelled or caused a scene. They've seen angry men before. They've dealt with zealots and rebels. But Jesus is different. He's calm, calculated. He's not just flipping tables. He's flipping power. Structures he's not calling for reform. He's acting like the temple doesn't even matter anymore. And that is something they cannot ignore. Because for them, the temple is everything. It's how they control the people. It's how they hold on to power. It's how they measure holiness. And Jesus is tearing all of it down without ever touching a stone. When he says, "Do not make my Father's house a marketplace," he's not scolding them, he's revealing their heart, that they've taken something sacred and turned it into business. Not just financial business, but spiritual business. They've built an empire out of exclusivity. And Jesus threatens that with a single sentence. He doesn't just call out corruption, he exposes the truth that the system itself was never enough. That it was always meant to point to something greater, something coming, someone coming. Him? And what The Chosen captures so powerfully is this undercurrent of inevitability. As the episode unfolds, you can feel it's a pressure building. The way Jesus moves through the temple, the way the disciples look at him, confused and stunned. They know something has changed, even if they can't name it. Because this isn't the gentle teacher anymore. This is the Messiah on a mission. And from this moment forward, everything accelerates. The Sanhedrin doesn't just want to silence him, they want him gone, eliminated. And Jesus doesn't run from it. He steps right into it. That's the tragedy and the triumph of this scene, that Jesus chooses to provoke what he knows will end in his own death. Not because he loves conflict, but because he loves people. Because he will not stand by and let the Gentiles be pushed out, or the poor priced out, or the unclean shut out. He flips the tables not to start a fight, but to start a revolution. And the temple will never recover. Asterisk everything. We've seen in The Chosen Season 5 Episode 2 leads to this one truth. Jesus is building a kingdom without walls. A kingdom not made of stone and silver, but of people. People from every nation, every background, every story. And what most viewers don't realize is that this episode isn't just about what Jesus tore down. It's about what he's starting to build. When he flips those tables and clears the temple courts, he's not trying to fix the system, he's announcing its end. He's making it clear that the kingdom of God won't operate by the old rules anymore. There will be no more outer courts, no more layers of holiness, no more limits to who can come close. This isn't just theology's revolution. And it's deeply personal. Because think about what that scene looked like to the Gentiles watching. They stood at the edge of the crowd, likely used to being ignored, shoved aside, spoken over. And suddenly, a Jewish rabbi steps into their space not to push them out, but to push everything else out. The animals, the noise, the money, the chaos. Their court, the one place they were allowed, had become a market, but now it was being restored, cleansed, emptied for something greater. Imagine what that must have felt like. For the first time, someone was fighting for their right to worship. For the first time, someone saw them not as outsiders, but as beloved. That's the part of this episode that most people miss. This wasn't just Jesus making a scene, it was Jesus making space, clearing a path, preparing the way for all nations to come to the Father. And it wouldn't stop at the temple. Because Jesus wasn't just thinking about the Gentiles of that day, he was thinking about the world to come, about Rome, about Egypt, about Pakistan, Brazil, America, about you, about me, about everyone who would one day feel like they weren't holy enough, pure enough, chosen enough to come to God. And in this single act of divine fury, Jesus declares, "You are welcome." But there's more, because while Jesus is welcoming the world in, he knows what it will cost. And this is where the weight of the episode truly sinks in. He knows that challenging the temple system isn't just bold, it's deadly. From the moment he clears the courts, his death is no longer a matter of if, but when. The religious elite now see him as a threat too dangerous to ignore. Not because he broke the rules, but because he revealed how fragile those rules truly were. And here's where The Chosen shows us something extraordinary. Jesus doesn't flinch. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't back away from the conflict. Because he knows that if there's going to be a kingdom without walls, someone has to knock them down first. Someone has to step into the middle of that chaos and say, no more. No more separation. No more exclusion. No more religious performance. Jesus becomes the gate, the way in, the place where heaven meets earth. Not in a room, not in a ritual, but in a person. And that person is willing to be broken, just like those temple tables, so that we could be made whole. Even the language he uses is a clue to something bigger. In one gospel account, when the leaders challenge him for disrupting the temple, Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." At first, everyone thought he was talking about the building, but he wasn't. He was talking about himself, because he is the new temple. He is where sacrifice meets mercy, where judgment meets grace, where God meets man. The Chosen doesn't just dramatize. It reveals it. It brings it to life in a way that's raw and disruptive, just like Jesus. Himself, it shows us that God was never interested in rituals for their own sake. He was never impressed by gold, by grandeur, by perfect traditions. He was interested in hearts. And when those hearts were being kept away, boxed out by the very people who claimed to represent him, Jesus did what only he could do. He walked in, flipped the whole thing upside down and said, "This ends now." And so, here we are, watching history and eternity collide in one explosive scene. Watching Jesus rewrite the rules, not with a sword, but with passion, with love, with truth. That's what makes this episode so unforgettable. That's what most people miss. It's not about anger. It's not even about justice. It's about love so fierce that it looks like fury. Love so holy that it tears through tradition. Love so determined that it risks everything. This episode isn't just a turning point in the series. It's a turning point in the story of redemption. It shows us a Jesus who doesn't settle for silence, who doesn't tolerate barriers, who doesn't blink in the face of death if it means we get to live. This Jesus, the one who flips tables and hearts, isn't tame. He's not safe. But he is good, and he's making room for you, for me, for all of us who thought we had to stand at the edge. The temple may fall, but the kingdom is just getting started.